Number 9. Crashed search and rescue plane. While flying from Alaska to Montana in 1950, a C-54 Skymaster military airplane vanished seemingly into thin air. There were 44 people aboard, including 3 civilians, when the aircraft went missing in the sky over Canada's Yukon Territory. Not a single sign of the plane or anyone on it has ever been found, and it isn't for a lack of trying. A search and rescue SAR mission was launched an hour after the Skymaster failed to arrive in Montana. American and Canadian authorities scoured a 350,000 square mile, 906,500 kilometers squared portion of the Pacific Northwest with zero luck. The only possible signs of the missing plane were some unintelligible radio signals and an eyewitness report of a large plane flying overhead in British Columbia, 500 miles, 805 kilometers south of the Yukon border. At least 4 of the 85 aircraft involved in the search crashed. One of them was a Douglas C-47 Skytrain that encountered poor weather while flying near a mountain in Whitehorse. A downdraft hit the aircraft, causing it to crash into some snow and rocks. Thankfully, all 10 crew members were rescued and the plane was abandoned at the site. It remains on the mountainside today, where it seems permanently affixed to the landscape and sometimes gets buried in snow. This crashed rescue plane may serve as a reminder, but as for the remnants of the plane they were searching for, no evidence of that particular crash have ever been found. Number 8. Lindbreen Tunic. Hundreds of artifacts have appeared among Norway's melting glaciers in recent years as climate change ramps up with no end in sight. In 2011, archaeologists discovered a greenish-brown bundle of woven fabric on the rapidly receding Lindbreen Glacier. The garment was found all by itself at an altitude of over 6,500 feet, 1,981 meters above sea level. Researchers identified it as an Iron Age tunic from sometime between 230 and 390 AD. At over 1,500 years old, it predates the Viking era. It's the oldest piece of clothing ever discovered in Norway, and one of the only surviving garments from this period ever found in Europe. The wool tunic was repaired and patched several times, indicating that its owner got a lot of use out of it. In fact, it may have passed through the hands of several owners. Based on its size, the garment was likely worn by a boy or a slender man. Its patterns and materials suggest that it was not made by an expert, but that whoever made it spent a lot of time on it. At the time, textile production was an unavoidably time-consuming task. Recreating it was also a lengthy process, as modern hand weavers learned when they spent a combined 760 hours creating a replica of the tunic, which is on display at the Norwegian Mountain Center. While the warming global temperatures that are responsible for melting the glaciers that lead to discoveries like this are concerning, the discoveries themselves are fascinating. Number 7. Antarctic Explorer's Journal. During the summer of 2014, a clump of soaking wet paper appeared in the melting ice near Cape Evans on Antarctica's Ross Island. It was the journal of a biologist named George Murray Levick, who accompanied Robert Falcon Scott on the ill-fated British Antarctic expedition from 1910 to 1913. Also known as the Terra Nova mission, the group's goal was to become the first explorers to reach the South Pole. The competing Amundsen expedition beat the Scots party to the South Pole, and 5 members of the Terra Nova party died in the unforgiving cold. Levick survived the mission, but not without seriously suffering in the process. The ambitious explorer described his experiences spending 7 months stranded in a small, cramped ice cave in 1912, when he and other surviving group members were unable to reach their ship. When winter ended, Levick marched 200 miles, 322 kilometers, to the expedition's base camp, dropping his journal along the way. Conservationists painstakingly reconstructed and digitized it in 2014, over a century after the expedition met its tragic end. Levick wrote about the behaviors of an Adelie penguin colony that he observed during breeding season. He was shocked by the hypersexual behavior of young males who were so eager to mate that they made advances on anything around them that remotely resembled a fertile partner, including chicks and dead females. Levick's notes are important to modern scholars because the area he was observing, known as Ridley Beach, is home to the world's largest Adelie penguin colony. Scientists have remarked that Levick was ahead of his time as a scientist. and they believe that Ridley Beach will eventually be lost to rising sea levels caused by climate change, making his observations all the more valuable. Number 6. A hidden oasis. It might surprise you to learn that Antarctica is home to an underground cave complex where temperatures sit consistently at around 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Located beneath Mount Erebus on Ross Island, the subterranean system is kept comfortable by a combination of the volcano's extreme heat and the blistering Antarctic cold. A person could enter the caves and feel comfortable in a t-shirt, according to Sarah Dwynn Fraser, who led a 2017 study on the Hidden Oasis. Her team discovered DNA evidence of algae, mosses, and small animals on soil samples from within the complex. Based on these findings, the team suspects that Antarctica may contain living organisms that haven't been discovered yet. But they also conceded that the genetic material may have been blown onto the continent from elsewhere. The first step in determining if there are living organisms within the caves involves having biologists search for evidence of them. Researchers are also developing a 3D model of the cave system to make it easier to navigate, which will hopefully lead to the discovery of more caves. On a continent that's 98% covered in ice up to 1.2 miles, 1.9 kilometers thick, a discovery like this seems hard to believe. But it's very real, and it's one of several reminders in recent years that there's a lot about Antarctica that we have yet to learn. Number 5. High Altitude Viking Sword. In 2017, reindeer hunters discovered an 1100-year-old Viking sword in the mountains of Norway's Oppland region. Spotted between two large rocks at an altitude of 5,380 feet, it's believed to be the highest elevation that a Viking sword has ever been found. The weapons finders led archaeologists to the site, where they hoped to find more artifacts and perhaps even a Viking burial. But their search was fruitless, posing the question of how the lone sword ended up there. Someone may have dropped it while hiking through the woods, and the person may have died nearby. But for now, all experts can do is speculate about its origins. The sword contained traces of lichen, indicating that there were periods when it was exposed, despite having spent a great deal of time buried in the snow and ice. But something doesn't add up. It should have more lichen on it, based on the short summers it sat through for roughly 1,000 years before it was discovered. The weapon should also be more corroded than it is. It's in excellent condition and would even be functional today if it were fitted with a new handle, according to scientists at the University of Oslo who studied the artifact. They believe that its remarkable condition may result from being in a somewhat dry location between two boulders, as well as the lack of corrosive salt in the high-altitude environment. How do you suspect the sword ended up in such a high and isolated spot? Let me know your theories in the comments, and while you are sharing, make sure to take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Number 4. The Long Ago Person. In 1999, 3 Canadian sheep hunters discovered human remains on a melting glacier in British Columbia near the Yukon border. The partial skeleton was surrounded by an ancient walking stick, bones, a hat, a leather bag, weapons, and a fur garment made from gopher skins. The sheep hunters alerted experts at the Beringia Center Museum. Because the remains were found on traditional Champagne and Aishahik First Nations territory, tribal representatives were also notified. The First Nations and the British Columbia government jointly agreed to manage the discovery together, ensuring that scientific research could be carried out while respecting indigenous values and customs. The bones belonged to a man who lived around 300 years ago, during the early 18th century. He was healthy when he died, sometime between the ages of 17 and 22, suggesting that an unexpected accident may have killed him. The iron blade knife and spear thrower found alongside the man indicate that he may have been a hunter. Those in charge of the excavation named the man Puede Dan Sinichi, which means long ago person found, in the traditional Tachon language of the Champagne and Aishahik people. An analysis of his digestive tract revealed that he ate beach asparagus and shellfish during his final hours, meaning he probably started his ill-fated journey near saltwater. He had eaten shellfish for most of his life and had only switched to eating meat a month or two before he perished. Scientists believe that he grew up near a coast, spent some of his last months inland, and then returned to the shore shortly before his death. But they're unsure of where he was headed or what the purpose of his journey was. DNA evidence traced Puede Dan Sinichi to 17 of his living relatives. In 2001, scientists returned the man's remains to the Champagne and Aishahik nations, who cremated him and returned the ashes to his original resting place. Number 3. Pegasus wreckage. A pair of pilots from New Zealand were faced with a tough decision on October 8, 1970, while flying over Antarctica in a C-21 Lockheed Constellation plane called the Pegasus, whether or not to continue along their planned route in the face of an incoming storm. They were short on fuel, so flying back to New Zealand wasn't an option, but they'd have to fly through the horrendous weather in order to land at McMurdo Station. With 80 people on board, it was important to make the safest choice possible, but neither option was safe. The pilots decided to continue flying toward McMurdo. They soon encountered whiteouts and heavy winds that jostled the plane around so badly, parts were being ripped off in midair. The aircraft began to descend rapidly as it approached its destination. Thankfully, the pilots managed to land it safely outside the base, where it skidded along the ground before finally stopping. Everyone survived with no major injuries and continued on with their plans, leaving the plane at the crash site. The Pegasus still sits outside McMurdo today, where it's often concealed by layers of ice and snow. Number 2. Stranded explorers' photos. In 2013, conservationists with the New Zealand's Antarctic Heritage Trust discovered a box filled with century-old photo negatives at an old explorer's shack on Ross Island, known as Scott's Hut. The 22 negatives were found stuck together, covered in mold and encased in a block of ice in a photographer's darkroom. They underwent a delicate restoration process at the hands of conservator Mark Strange, who gently and painstakingly separated the negatives and cleaned the mold off them. Then he developed and digitized the photos. The images feature members of the Ross Sea Party, who assisted with the failed overland expedition of explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton. Their job was to lay supply lines ahead of Shackleton's journey across the continent. The crew became stranded at Scott's Hut in 1915 when their ship, the Aurora, blew away during a blizzard. For the next year and a half, the 10-person team lived in the abandoned hut, which was built by members of the catastrophic Terra Nova expedition just a few years earlier. During their stay, they suffered from scurvy, frostbite, and exhaustion while surviving on a starvation diet. At times, the crew had no choice but to eat dog kibble in order to stay alive. Yet they continued to set up Shackleton's supply route, using a flimsy tent as a shelter while they were out on the ice. 3 men died, and the rest came close to it. The Aurora finally returned for the 7 severely weakened survivors in early 1917, and they sailed back to New Zealand. These never-before-seen images feature some of the crew members amid the ominous landscape that they would call home for far longer than planned. The collection is extremely valuable to researchers because it contains some of the only photos of the Ross Sea Party that have ever been found. Number 1. Giant wolf head. As the world's glaciers recede due to climate change, revealing fascinating artifacts, the Siberian permafrost is melting at an alarming rate, leading to equally remarkable finds. In 2018, a local resident named Pavel Efimov discovered the severed head of a prehistoric wolf in northern Siberia's Abyskaya district. The adult wolf died around 32,000 years ago, between the ages of 2 and 4 years old. Its fur and teeth were found intact, along with its brain and some soft tissue. The animal's head measures 15.7 inches, roughly half the length of a modern wolf's body. It comes from an extinct lineage distinct from modern wolves, and its head is so huge that it almost looks like a bear at first glance. It's not uncommon to find wolves in the permafrost, but most are much smaller than this, and it's the first time remains have been found with perfectly preserved tissue. It's unclear how the wolf's head was severed or what happened to the rest of its remains. There's no evidence indicating that humans were responsible, according to experts. At the time of the discovery, scientists announced plans to try extracting the creature's DNA in hopes of sequencing its genome and learning more about how modern wolves evolved. Number 9. Buried MiG-21 fighter jet. In 2017, the Prague Rudolfinum Gallery celebrated its 100th exhibition by ceremonially burying a Soviet MiG-21 supersonic fighter jet in the Czech village of Dolní Březany. British contemporary artist Roger Hyorns came up with the idea as a symbolic way to mark the end of an era that saw the development of MiG planes and other war machines. By putting a plane, something that is typically in the sky, into the ground, the event was a funeral of sorts. It was Hyorns' way of saying goodbye to a distinctive period in history. The Mikoyan Gruvich MiG-21 was developed in the 1950s as Cold War tensions ramped up between the Soviet Union and the United States. Over 10,000 were produced, and they've been used by militaries in over 50 countries. Some are still in use today, making the MiG-21 the longest manufactured and most widely used fighter aircraft in history. The plane that Hyorns buried was built in 1971 and decommissioned in 1996. Finding a MiG-21 and getting all the necessary paperwork out of the way were just one step of the process. The project required decontaminating the jet, conserving it to prevent future pollution, and assembling workers and equipment to carry out the burial. This is the second plane that Hyorns has put in the ground as part of his vision of burying an entire fleet of aircraft in various places throughout the world. Number 8. Auradower sur Glane. On June 10, 1944, the Nazis entered the French village of Auradower sur Glane and demanded to see the residents' identity papers. They locked the women and children in a church and forced the men into a separate building. Then, they massacred and looted the village, killing 643 people in just a few hours' time. Only 6 people survived the ordeal, in addition to 20 who had fled immediately upon the Nazis' arrival. One of them said that the Nazis shot the men in the legs until they couldn't move, then set the building on fire, leaving the victims to slowly perish. After that, the Nazi soldiers blew up the church, causing the women and children to flee through the windows. Those who tried to escape were shot to death with machine guns. SS Commander Adolf Deichmann claimed that the massacre was in retaliation for the kidnapping and murder of a fellow officer. The survivors were allowed to return to Auradower sur Glane a week later to bury the dead. They built a new village nearby. After the war, General Charles de Gaulle decided not to allow the destroyed town to be rebuilt. He ordered for it to be preserved as a memorial dedicated to the lives lost and as a reminder of the Nazis' cruelty. Today, it sits in ruins. There's a museum at the ghost town's entrance with a memorial bearing the names of all the victims. It may seem morbid to some to preserve the remains of such a traumatic event, but by inviting visitors to reflect on what happened at Auradower sur Glane, the site keeps the senseless atrocities of hatred and war at the forefront of the national consciousness. Number 7. USS Grenadier. The U.S. Navy submarine USS Grenadier was scuttled in 1943 after being hit by Japanese bombs in the Strait of Malacca, roughly 92 miles off the coast of Phuket, Thailand. Its 76-man crew survived, only to be taken prisoner by the Japanese. For 2 years, they were beaten, tortured, and starved. Miraculously, all but 4 of the POWs lived to tell their story. In 2019, an expedition found a 307-foot-long submarine resting 285 feet below the water's surface with its hatches open. Exploring the site was complicated due to its depth, requiring the divers to make several brief visits. They had to breathe a special combination of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium, and could only stay at the wreck for a few minutes at a time. Based on its measurements and its location between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, the divers believe that the sunken submarine is the USS Grenadier. They sent the information along to the Naval History and Heritage Command, which is the agency in charge of verifying naval wrecks. Once confirmed, the submarine will fall under the protection of the Sunken Military Craft Act, which bans the disturbance of military vehicles owned by the US government regardless of where they are found. Number 6. Invisible pollution. Grunard Island is a small, uninhabited island that sits less than a mile, 0.6 kilometers, off the Scottish coast. In 1942, it became home to a top-secret testing facility for biological weapons. It is here that the UK government experimented with a deadly strain of anthrax called Volum 14578 by packing the pathogen into bombs and deploying the weapons on innocent flocks of sheep. The results showed that the Volum 14578 could contaminate entire German cities for decades. Consequently, the tests left Grenadier Island heavily polluted. During the 1980s, an environmental organization called Operation Dark Harvest began writing to newspapers about the toxic conditions at Grenadier. They claimed that 2 scientists had visited the site firsthand and collected soil samples, which the group threatened to leave in places that would make it impossible for the British government to ignore. The activists made good on their threat by leaving a sample outside the Porton Down military research facility, where tests confirmed that the soil contained anthrax. Decontamination efforts began in 1986. The most heavily contaminated soil was removed, and the entire island was sprayed with a formaldehyde solution diluted in seawater. To ensure that the cleanup was a success, a flock of sheep was left behind. They remained mostly healthy, and in 1990, Grenadier Island was officially declared anthrax-free. None of the sheep have tested positive for the poison since 2007. The details of what went on at Grenadier Island became publicly available for the first time in 1997, when documents about the biological warfare project were declassified. Some people believe that the site could still be toxic, but nobody will probably be going there anytime soon anyway, because it's privately owned. Number 5. Frozen Shelter. During World War I, a group of 20 Austro-Hungarian soldiers built a crude wooden shelter in the Italian Alps atop a 10,154-foot, 3,095-meter peak called Mount Scorluzzo. They spent the next 3.5 years living in the cramped, makeshift space while fighting the Italians in a long, drawn-out battle known as the White War. By the time the war ended in 1918, the soldiers had had enough of the unforgiving alpine climate, which saw winter temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit, -40 degrees Celsius. They abruptly closed up the shelter and abandoned it, leaving behind most of their belongings. The only people who went up there before the site was once again covered in ice were scrappers looking for metal to resell. Relics from the White War were first discovered during the 1990s as global warming accelerated the melting of glaciers. Since then, an array of perfectly preserved artifacts have appeared, including letters, diaries, weapons, and other personal belongings. Soldiers' bodies have also been recovered. Researchers entered the barracks on Mount Scorluzzo for the first time in 2017, after the ice that had encased it for nearly 100 years had melted away. They found food, dishes, bottles, animal skin jackets, straw mattresses, coins, helmets, ammunition, and other items that reflect the troops' dismal daily lives. Of the 150,000 men who died in the White War, roughly 2/3 were killed by avalanches, frostbite, landslides, illness, and other circumstances relating to the harsh environment. The shelter on Mount Scorluzzo is just one of many that have been discovered in recent decades, seemingly frozen in time. It's likely that more of these sites will appear as climate change continues to dramatically alter the landscape. Climate change is a decidedly negative thing overall, but there have definitely been some pretty cool discoveries thanks to the softening of several frozen areas. Do you know of any other interesting discoveries thanks to the thawing caused by global warming? Let us know in the comments below and make sure to like and subscribe. Number 4. Love letters. During renovations at the Esplanade Hotel in Scarborough, England, earlier this year, workers found a trove of World War II artifacts hidden beneath the floorboards of a utility room. The collection includes an old Vaseline tin, old cigarette packs, toothpaste tubes, and candy wrappers. There's also a handful of letters that were exchanged by a couple who were deeply in love. The pair wrote about trivial details of their everyday lives, like the weather, outings with friends, and having sore gums from an abscess. They also expressed feeling lonely and depressed, and thinking about each other as their days apart painfully dragged by. One letter states, "Wherever you go, my darling, don't ever forget that I love you more than anything else on earth." The letters aren't signed, but the Scarborough Historical and Archaeological Society, SHAC, is hoping to identify the writers. They believe that the correspondence dates back to sometime between 1941 and 1944, and that one of the parties may have been a British soldier from one of the numerous military units that were stationed at the hotel throughout the war. The woman wrote a return address on one of the letters, which was traced to a couple named Jesse and James McConnell. Their son, John, served in the Royal Air Force before dying tragically in a plane crash in 1943 at just 19 years old. Researchers believe that the letters could have been exchanged between John and his girlfriend. It's a strong lead, but it's still being investigated. The Shack is hoping to find more World War II relics inside the hotel, but on and off lockdown restrictions have slowed down their search. Discoveries like this may not be worth a lot of money, but they are treasures in their own right, offering a first-hand glimpse into the traumas of war and the emotional struggles that came along with being separated from loved ones. Number 3. Lunov Plan. Ground effect vehicles look like airplanes, but they're a little different. They travel close to the ground or water, using their wings to generate lift and reduce drag. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union developed several of these low-flying machines. One of them is the Lunov Plan, nicknamed the Caspian Sea Monster. It was designed during the 1970s. The only prototype that was ever completed served in the Soviet and Russian navies from 1987 until sometime during the late 90s. Known as the MD-60, it had large wings that flew roughly 13 feet, 4 meters above the water's surface. Equipped with 8 large turbofans, it had a maximum cruising speed of 340 miles per hour. The Lunov Plan was armed for anti-surface warfare, carrying 6 missile launchers grouped in pairs of 2. It had no chassis, which meant that it couldn't travel on land. Instead, the machine was stored on a custom-built dry floating dock, which was towed out into the water and submerged, leaving the Lunov Plan floating and ready to power up and go. The MD-60 could remain self-sufficient for up to 5 days at a time. At the time, it was the world's heaviest aircraft in operation. Today, the MD-60 sits abandoned at a naval base in Kaspesk, Russia. The only other planned Lun-class Lunov Plan was intended to serve as a mobile hospital. Military funding for the project was cut off when the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving it 90% finished. Number 2. Valley of Death Massacre. When the Nazis realized that they were going to lose World War II, they scrambled to hide evidence of their war crimes. In January of 1945, they marched 50 prisoners into the woods in northern Poland and shot them to death, one by one at close range. The victims' bodies were burned and buried in a mass grave. Until recently, this and another massacre that had happened nearby in 1939 were only known based on eyewitness accounts. Archaeologists finally discovered physical evidence of the atrocities this year while excavating in the area. The team dug up a morbid array of artifacts, including burnt human bones, jewelry, cigarette lighters, and bullet casings. Many massacres like this happened outside of concentration camps during the war, but these sites are rarely studied out of respect for Jewish beliefs, which prohibit the disturbance of human burials. The recently discovered site is located in a region nicknamed the Valley of Death, where the Nazis murdered hundreds of priests, intellectuals, disabled people, and Jewish families. Personal belongings have helped to identify some of the victims' remains. Experts are performing DNA tests in hopes of naming more victims and finding any surviving relatives. But it's unlikely that they'll identify every person due to the sheer number of killings that happened there. After the testing is done, the remains will be respectfully reburied in the town of Chodnice. Number 1. Red Army Tank. In 2015, workers discovered an abandoned Red Army tank in a swamp near the town of Sino in Belarus, where it had gotten stuck in the mud during World War II. Known as the Klement Voroshilov 1 or KV-1, the model was named after a Soviet Union marshal and dates as far back as 1941, the same year the Germans invaded Belarus. At the time, it was the standard heavy tank of the Soviet military. The KV-1 was extremely effective against most German anti-tank weapons, thanks to its heavy armored plate. Salvage crews worked together to remove the tank from the swamp, where it had sat for over 70 years. Video footage of the recovery shows obvious damage to the vehicle, but it was unclear whether someone destroyed it on purpose before it got stuck in the mud, or if it was damaged after it became stranded. The tank may have been used in the 1941 Battle of Sino, which saw 2,250 of the vehicles go head-to-head in one of World War II's biggest tank battles. Both the Red Army and the Nazis suffered big losses, but the Soviets ultimately lost. This greatly weakened the area's Red Army troops, making it much easier for the Germans to advance through the region. Number 9. Edward Bolin Shipwreck. Namibia's Skeleton Coast is notorious for its unforgiving conditions. This 500-mile, 805-kilometer stretch of remote coastline is rife with decaying shipwrecks and animal bones that serve as an ominous reminder of how death is never too far away. News reporters once described the region as the closest that our planet can probably get to the end of the Earth. In a place where the vast ocean meets with the unforgiving desert, civilization couldn't feel any further away. Thick fog, rough seas, unpredictable currents, and heavy winds have stranded hundreds of marine vessels over the centuries, turning the Skeleton Coast into a de facto ship graveyard. Sailors who managed to reach land often died of thirst in the scorching desert heat. In 1909, a 310-foot-long, 95 meters cargo ship called the Edward Bolin became trapped in a fog and ran aground along this desolate area, the Skeleton Coast. Over the years, the desert encroached upon the shoreline, partially burying the wreck in the process. Today, the seemingly out-of-place vessel sits over 1,000 feet, 305 meters, from the water. It's accompanied by 2 nearby wrecks, the Otavi, which foundered and sank in 1945, and MV Dunedin Star, a cargo liner ran aground in 1942. These are just 3 of the dozens of ships that met disaster along the Skeleton Coast and now litter the shoreline as they give way to the effects of time and the harsh environment they've come to rest in. As devoid of life as the region may seem at first glance, it's actually home to numerous animals who have adapted to life in the desert, including elephants, hyenas, leopards, cheetahs, giraffes, and flamingos. There are also several marine creatures who commonly inhabit the waters offshore, including Cape Fur seals and 11 different shark species. But the only other humans you're likely to see are fellow visitors and people working in the tourism industry. Number 8. Peter Grant Mansion. Canada's largest house is a 65,000 square foot, 6,039 meters squared, lakefront mansion in northern Ontario. It was supposed to be the dream home and corporate office of millionaire Peter Grant, who made his fortune in the lumber industry. Construction began in 2005 with plans to install an art gallery, waterfalls, a golf course, and a squash court. The sprawling estate features 2 elevators, an observation lighthouse, an indoor pool, a huge hot tub, 2 30-foot, 9.1 meters fireplaces, and a boathouse big enough for a 40-foot, 12.2 meters yacht. In 2007, the lumber industry faced a downturn. Not long after that, the global recession set in and the American housing market crisis forced Grant's struggling company to file for protection from creditors. Construction on the home stopped in 2008 and never resumed. It would cost just $1 million to finish building the mansion, according to the Urban Explorer blog Talking Walls Photography. But it sits, derelict and fenced off on the shore of Timiskaming, with no trespassing signs around the perimeter. The unfinished property is an eyesore that looks more like a decrepit industrial facility than a home. It has plywood floors, unfinished walls, incomplete electrical wiring, and has been vandalized. The mansion was put up for sale in 2010 with an asking price of $25 million. A Toronto-based company bought it and installed security cameras, but did little else. It's a frustrating situation, according to Timiskaming Shore's Mayor Carmen Kidd, who described the building as wasted potential in a 2018 CBC interview. Earlier this year, the reporter stated that it is unclear who the mansion's current owners are, but that they haven't paid taxes on the property in 3 years and are neglecting the house as it falls further into disrepair. Number 7. Roadside Mobile Home. A little over a month ago, someone left a mobile home on a Texas roadside and never returned for it. Locals reported its presence to a deputy soon after it appeared, but Hockley County Sheriff Ray Cyphers was unaware of the abandoned trailer until mid-November. He first learned of it from staff at the local newspaper who reached out after receiving a tip from a reader. The home was left on a transport trailer next to a cotton field, with an orange barrier separating it from the road. All identifying markers were stripped from the trailer, complicating law enforcement's ability to track down the owner. Cyphers acknowledged that the mobile home may have been dumped illegally by someone who didn't feel like disposing of it properly, but he was careful not to jump to conclusions, pointing out that someone may have left the trailer there because they were having trouble moving it, and that the person may still be working on solving the issue. For now, police are simply waiting and hoping to find out what happened. Not long after the trailer appeared in Texas, someone abandoned a mobile home near an intersection in Greene County, Missouri. Police were left scratching their heads, and they asked the public for help identifying the owner. Tips led them to a male suspect who is facing criminal charges for illegally dumping the property. Number 6. Diver's Palace. Poland's Lower Silesia region is famous for its castles and palaces. One of them, nicknamed the Diver's Palace, stands out among the rest. Located on a farm complex, it carries an inherently spooky look and feel, and is shrouded in mystery. Internet searches turn up very little information about the vacant home. According to urban explorers, Diver's Palace is surrounded by buildings that are occupied. It's been abandoned since 2014 and appears to have been used for a commercial venture based on documents that were found scattered inside the home. The derelict mansion is filled with reminders of its lavish past, including velvet drapes and marble steps. There are reportedly signs of renovation work going on at the site, but it's hard to see how it would be possible to restore the structural integrity of the Diver's Palace, which is filled with collapsed ceilings and unstable floors. If there are any existing plans for the future of the site, nobody knows what they are. Number 5. T42. While walking through the forest in Cumbria County in northwestern England, recently a photographer named Ashley Cooper spotted an afternoon tea setup in the middle of the woods. The out-of-place arrangement consisted of a table, 2 chairs, partially eaten food, and dining ware. Cooper initially thought he had stumbled upon a whimsical art exhibit, but he soon realized that wasn't the case at all. He told the BBC that the scene looked as if a couple had enjoyed a romantic meal but couldn't clean up after themselves, as if they just got up and left. Employees from nearby hotels confirmed that they had no involvement with the mysterious outdoor dine and dash scene. As Britain eases its COVID-19 lockdown restrictions, the region is experiencing a worsening problem with littering. Cooper said that over the last year and a half, he's seen numerous abandoned campsites, including tents, cooking equipment, and sleeping bags. He described the wave of people flocking to the area as a very different type of visitor who has no respect for the place whatsoever. As he pointed out, whoever set up the Tea for Two went through the trouble of carrying the supplies a good half-mile, 0.8 kilometers, into the woods from the nearest trail. Yet, they were unwilling to put in that same amount of effort to leave the forest as clean as they found it. But Cooper may have been a little too quick in his decision to criticize what he saw. A company called DateMate, which specializes in romantic occasions, later came forward and said that they staged the event for a vacationing couple. A spokesperson told the BBC that Cooper had discovered the scene in the short time between when the couple left and when she arrived to clean up after them. Would you consider an elaborate tea for two set up in the middle of the woods a good idea? Do you think there are other abandoned setups that are actually in the process of being cleared when they are discovered? Tell me in the comments below, and make sure you also like and subscribe for more content. Number 4. Dachakov. Sometime during the early 20th century, a wealthy Russian colonel named Andrei Valerinovich Kvitko built a mansion in Sochi. Situated on a cliff overlooking the Black Sea, it was reportedly meant to look like a mansion in Italy that was owned by the wealthy family of Kvitko's wife. They only enjoyed the newly built home for about a year before the Russian Revolution began in 1917. Being of Tsarist loyalties, Kvitko knew that he was in danger. He and his wife fled to Italy. The state took possession of their mansion and converted it into a home for troubled teens. After that, it became a vacation home. It functioned as a hospital during World War II, then became a sanatorium. Renovation work began during the late 80s, but it was never finished by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, and the money for these types of projects ran out. Since then, the house has sat abandoned and without a roof. There's been talk in recent years about fixing it up, but nothing has happened yet. The mansion is in really bad shape, and it would cost an enormous amount of money to save it. It's so damaged, in fact, that explorers are urged to use extreme caution and not to go upstairs. Number 3. Classic Car Graveyard. A group of explorers who run the Lost Adventures YouTube channel recently discovered an abandoned car graveyard at an undisclosed location in England. They found the site after hearing rumors that there was a collection of cars sitting in a field. Footage captured by the team reveals dozens of vintage British-made cars, including a Porsche 924, an Aston Martin Lagonda, a Jaguar MK1, and a rare Triumph Vitesse, as well as Bentleys and Rolls-Royces. Most were manufactured during the post-war era, which lasted from the late 1940s through the 50s. Some of the cars are high-end models, while others were tailored to more ordinary customers. The vehicles have been exposed to the elements for quite some time. Their conditions vary, but they all appear to be in a state of decay, and they'll only continue to rust out unless someone takes action to save them. The team was apparently in utter disbelief as they investigated the property and described the experience as unforgettable, but they didn't reveal any identifying details about the car graveyard's location or if rescuing the vehicles is a realistic prospect. Number 2. A Beachside Villa. Several months ago, TikTok user Colopanza Vlogs posted footage of a crumbling villa on the shore of La Puntilla Beach in El Salvador. The video went viral, and visitors flocked to the site to get a first-hand look at the ruins. There's an intact staircase inside the lopsided, graffiti-covered structure, which some visitors dare to climb, despite the warnings of danger scrawled across the interior. Some even claim that the villa is haunted by a so-called tall man. Nobody seems to know how the villa came to rest on the beach, where water flows in and out of its lower level as the tides change. Some speculate that the infamous 1998 storm known as Hurricane Mitch was responsible. It was one of history's deadliest storms, killing over 9,000 people as 75 inches, 191 centimeters of rain pounded down on the region, resulting in mudslides and flash floods that swept away entire towns. It's unclear how long the villa has been at its current location, but it's definitely possible that it's been there a while, and that it was a well-kept secret among locals before it appeared on social media. Some residents said that they believe it was once a hotel called Puerto Ventura, and that it was built along the beach. According to this version of events, it was abandoned around 25 years ago. A fisherman named Oscar Valencia told a local news outlet that the villa was built too deep in the beach without obtaining official permission to build. For now, the building's origins are a mystery, and perhaps this is part of the appeal that's drawing people there. Number 1. Gainsthorpe. There are an estimated 2,000 abandoned villages throughout England. One of them, known as Gainsthorpe, dates at least as far back as 1086, when it was listed in official records under the name Gainsthorpe. The village was run by Ivo Tallyboys, the Lord of Gainsthorpe. He was a powerful nobleman who rubbed elbows with William the Conqueror. In exchange for his services, he received property in Lincolnshire, where he established Gainsthorpe. Little else is known about the historic settlement. During the late 14th and 15th centuries, it fell under the jurisdiction of the Duchy of Cornwall. Historians believe that by then, the village had shrunk considerably in size. According to historical records, it was abandoned entirely by 1616. A 17th century antiquarian named Abraham de la Prim wrote in 1697 that Gainsthorpe consisted of 3 abandoned streets lined with some 200 buildings. He also noted that local thieves had allegedly used the deserted village as a headquarters before residents of nearby settlements drove them away. De la Prim doubted this account, writing that he suspected poverty, time, and pasturage caused Gainsthorpe's downfall. Nobody knows why the village was abandoned. The Black Plague may have played a role, and it's also possible that the lucrative wool farming industry drew residents elsewhere. Gainsthorpe's ruins are still visible today, although they've been obscured by time and the elements. They are easier to identify from a bird's eye view. The site contains the remnants of 4 roads and around 25 buildings. Archaeologists have never excavated at Gainsthorpe, which at least partially explains why there are so many unanswered questions surrounding it. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about mysterious abandoned places, let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you next time.